The human mind is a kingdom unto itself. It is a vast and intricate landscape, with sunlit plains of reason, soaring mountains of ambition, and deep, quiet valleys of contemplation. It builds empires of logic, cathedrals of faith, and fortresses of identity. But this kingdom, like any ancient land, has its borderlands. These are the shadowy, liminal territories where the familiar laws of cause and effect seem to warp and bend into strange new shapes. These are the realms of panic, of ecstasy, of belief so powerful it can override the body's most basic commands for survival. And sometimes, very rarely in the course of human history, a contagion can sweep through these borderlands. Not a virus, not a bacterium, but an idea, a fear, a behavior, a madness that leaps from mind to mind with terrifying speed, until an entire community is caught in its grip, acting out a bizarre, shared nightmare in the stark light of day. Most of these events are lost to us, dismissed by later generations as folklore, as peasant superstition, as the garbled ravings of an ignorant past. But tonight, we are going to investigate one that was not. It is a story so strange, so meticulously documented by sober and educated contemporary observers, and so horrifying in its outcome that it has baffled historians, physicians, sociologists, and psychologists for 500 years. It is a story that begins with a single person, a single housewife on a single summer day, in a single city, and ends with hundreds of citizens caught in a terrifying, involuntary death dance from which there was, for many, no escape. This is not a legend. This is not a Grimm's fairy tale. This is a true and deeply unsettling piece of strange history. We are traveling back to the high summer of 1518, to the proud and prosperous city of Strasbourg in the Holy Roman Empire, to bear witness to the outbreak of the Dancing Plague 1518. It remains one of the most extreme, most lethal, and most thoroughly documented cases of mass hysteria ever recorded. It is an unexplained phenomena that forces us to confront the terrifying power of the human mind when it is pushed past the breaking point and the thin, fragile veneer of reality that separates our ordered world from collective madness. To truly understand the madness that was about to consume the city of Strasbourg, we must first understand the city itself. We must peel back the centuries and try to see it, to smell it, to feel it as its citizens did. Picture it in your mind. The year is 1518. Strasbourg is a bustling, important city, a free imperial city, which meant it was a semi-independent republic, a self-governing entity within the vast, patchwork quilt of the Holy Roman Empire. Its magnificent sandstone cathedral, with its single, impossibly delicate Gothic spire, dominates the skyline for miles around. It was, for a time, the tallest building in the world, a testament to the city's wealth, its civic pride, and its profound piety. The city is nestled on an island in the River Ill. Its streets are a labyrinth of narrow, cobblestoned alleys, some no wider than a cart. The timber-framed houses lean precariously against one another, their upper stories jutting out over the street below, creating a perpetual twilight in the lanes. The air is thick with the smells of a pre-industrial city, a rich and pungent symphony of life. The comforting scent of wood smoke from countless chimneys, the aroma of baking bread from the neighborhood ovens, the sharp tang of tanning leather from the tanner's district, the metallic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. But mingled with these are the ever-present, less pleasant smells of urban life, the stench of open sewers, the reek of the butcher's refuse, and the damp, earthy scent of the river that was both the city's lifeblood and its primary drain. This was a city of artisans, merchants, and clerics. It was a place of guilds and regulations, of deeply ingrained social hierarchies. Life was governed by the ringing of church bells, marking the hours for prayer and for work. It was a city of law and order, proud of its institutions and its place in the world. But beneath this veneer of civic pride and bustling commerce, the Strasbourg of 1518 was a city steeped in a deep and profound anxiety. The people who walked these streets lived in a world that felt both deeply ordered by a watchful, judgmental God and terrifyingly chaotic and unpredictable. Their lives were balanced on a knife's edge. And in the months and years leading up to that fateful summer, that knife's edge had become terrifyingly, cruelly thin. To understand the plague of dancing, you must first understand the succession of very real plagues of hardship that preceded it. First, and most fundamentally, the people of Strasbourg and the surrounding region of Alsace were starving. The preceding years had been exceptionally cruel. A series of harsh winters, late frosts, and wet, cold springs had led to catastrophic crop failures. The year 1517 was remembered in the chronicles as the Great Hunger. The granaries were empty. The price of wheat and rye, the very stuff of life, had skyrocketed to levels that were simply beyond the reach of the common person. Famine, a gaunt and terrifying specter, stalked the land. Orphanages were overflowing with children whose parents had succumbed. The city council made desperate attempts to control prices and distribute what little grain they had, but it was not enough. Beggars, their faces skeletal, their bodies emaciated, crowded the church steps, their pleas a constant, desperate chorus. The historical chronicles of the period are filled with grim, heartbreaking accounts of the suffering. People were reduced to eating the most desperate of foods: boiled roots and nettles, tree bark, sawdust mixed with flour, cats, dogs, and foul concoctions made from ground-up corn husks and scraps of leather. This was not a minor downer. This was a society-wide fight for basic survival. Every day was a struggle against a gnawing, debilitating hunger that frayed nerves, shortened tempers, and created an atmosphere of pervasive, hopeless despair. The chronic physical stress of malnutrition weakened every man, woman, and child. And with famine came its twin sister, disease. In a population weakened by hunger, sickness ran rampant. The dreaded leprosy, while in decline, was still a real and terrifying presence, its victims, the lepers, forced to live in colonies outside the city walls, ringing a bell to warn of their approach. But there were newer, more frightening diseases as well. Syphilis, which had only arrived in Europe from the Americas a few decades earlier, was ravaging the population. It was known as the French pox, and its horrific symptoms, disfiguring sores, madness, and a slow, agonizing death, were seen as a direct and terrible punishment from God for the sin of lust. And then there were the fevers: smallpox, measles, and a mysterious ailment known as the English sweating sickness, which could kill a healthy person in a matter of hours, all made periodic, terrifying appearances. And always, lurking in the back of everyone's mind, was the collective trauma, the ancestral memory of the Black Death. Though the Great Plague of the 14th century was long past, smaller, localized outbreaks were a constant threat. Every unexplained fever, every swollen lymph node in the groin or armpit, sparked a wave of primal terror. The world felt fragile, suffused with sickness, pain, and the constant threat of a sudden, agonizing death. On top of this profound physical misery was a deep and unsettling spiritual crisis. The monolithic authority of the Roman Catholic Church, the institution that had anchored European life and thought for 1,000 years, was beginning to crack under the weight of its own corruption and the pressure of new ideas. For the common person, the Church often seemed less a source of spiritual comfort and more a source of financial and spiritual burden. The upper echelons of the clergy, the bishops and abbots, were often seen as worldly princes, living in immense luxury, mired in political intrigue, while their flock starved. Parish priests were often poorly educated, and the gap between the ideals of Christianity and the reality of the Church was a source of widespread cynicism and resentment. The practice of selling indulgences was particularly galling. The Church taught that an indulgence was a certificate purchased for a fee that promised to reduce a soul's time in purgatory. It was, in effect, a way to buy one's way into heaven, a practice that seemed to mock the very idea of faith and repentance. It seemed that salvation itself had become a commodity, available only to the rich. Into this climate of deep spiritual discontent, a new and radical voice had just emerged. In the autumn of the previous year, 1517, a German monk and professor of theology named Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, some 300 miles to the northeast. This document was a searing critique of the practice of selling indulgences and a bold challenge to the authority of the Pope. Thanks to the revolutionary new technology of the printing press, Luther's ideas were spreading like wildfire, translated from Latin into German and distributed in pamphlets and woodcuts that could be understood even by the illiterate. For the people of Strasbourg, a literate and politically aware city, this was not an abstract theological debate. It was a seismic event that shook the very foundations of their spiritual world. If the Church could be wrong about something as fundamental as salvation, what else was it wrong about? If the Pope's authority was a lie, then who held the keys to heaven and hell? The old certainties were dissolving, replaced by a bewildering and frightening uncertainty. The world felt spiritually unmoored, adrift on a sea of doubt. This triple assault of famine, disease, and spiritual anxiety created a psychological tinderbox in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. The people were living under a level of chronic, inescapable stress that is almost impossible for us to imagine today. Their bodies were weak, their minds were filled with fear, and their souls were in turmoil. And into this tinderbox, a single, inexplicable spark was about to fall. The spark had a name. It was Frau Troffea. In the middle of July, on a hot, dusty summer day, Frau Troffea walked out of her home and into the narrow street in front of her house. And she began to dance. Let us be very clear about what this means. This was not a dance of joy or celebration. There was no music. There was no festival. Her face, according to the accounts, was a mask of distress. Her movements were convulsive, jerky, her arms flailing, her body twisting and gyrating without rhythm or grace. She was a puppet, and an unseen, malevolent force was pulling the strings. She did not stop. For hours she danced, alone in the street, under the hot sun, her feet pounding the hard cobblestones. Her neighbors came out of their houses to watch, first with curiosity, then with concern, and finally with alarm. They spoke to her, but she did not seem to hear them. Her eyes were glazed over, focused on some inner world of torment. Her husband, Herr Troffea, was horrified. He begged her to stop, but she was beyond his reach. She danced until her feet were swollen, bruised, and bleeding, until her body was slick with sweat, until she collapsed from sheer, agonizing exhaustion. But it was only a temporary reprieve. After a few hours of fitful, restless sleep, she would rise again, as if compelled by an irresistible command, and continue her frantic, silent, tortured dance. This went on for 6 days. For nearly a week, Frau Troffea was a public spectacle of suffering. She became a living embodiment of some terrible, unknown affliction. Her husband and the local authorities were at a loss. They could not restrain her. They could not reason with her. She was locked in a private hell, her body a prisoner of this relentless, involuntary motion. And then the contagion began. Within a week of Frau Troffea's ordeal starting, she was no longer alone. The spark had caught. The psychological tinder of the city had ignited. Several other people, mostly women, began to exhibit the same terrifying symptoms. They too walked into the streets and began to dance, their bodies racked by the same uncontrollable spasms. The fire was beginning to spread from mind to mind. By the end of the first week, historical sources state that over 30 people were dancing, without rest, in the streets of Strasbourg. This is the point where the story shifts from a series of individual tragedies to a full-blown civic crisis. The city's authorities, the prestigious council of guild masters and patricians known as the Magistrate of 21, were forced to intervene. These were not ignorant or superstitious men. They were, by the standards of their day, educated, pragmatic leaders. They did what any responsible government would do. They consulted the experts. They called upon the physicians of the local guild, men trained in the medical traditions that stretched back to ancient Greece. The diagnosis they received was, to our modern ears, bizarre. But it was based on the most advanced medical science of the day. The doctors, guided by the ancient Greek theory of the four humors blood, phlegm, Yellow bile and black bile concluded that the dancers were suffering from a natural disease caused by hot blood. They believed that an overheating of the blood in the brain was causing the frenzied behavior. This, they theorized, was likely exacerbated by an unfavorable alignment of the stars, a common explanation for widespread illness at the time. And if the diagnosis was hot blood, the prescription they offered was grimly logical, if fatally flawed. The cure, they declared, was to let the fever burn itself out through vigorous physical activity. The afflicted, they argued, must be encouraged to dance continuously, day and night, until the hot blood was sweated out and the body's natural humoral balance was restored. They essentially prescribed more of the disease as the cure. It was a medical decision that would have catastrophic consequences. This decision marked the turning point of the tragedy. It is the moment when the city's leaders, acting with the best of intentions and on the best available advice, threw gasoline on the fire. They decided not just to permit the dancing, but to actively facilitate it on a massive, public scale. They cleared out the city's large and important guild halls, the Zunfthäuser, turning them into dedicated dance halls. They even went so far as to clear the open-air grain market and the horse market, two of the city's most important public spaces, to create large, outdoor dance arenas. And then, in the most surreal and horrifying detail of the entire saga, they took it a step further. To further encourage the cure, they erected a large wooden stage in the middle of the market square. And they hired professional musicians, pipers, drummers, and horn players to provide a constant, pounding beat. They even hired healthy, strong dancers to dance alongside the afflicted, both to keep them moving and to provide a model for their frantic exertions. Try to imagine the scene. It is almost beyond comprehension. In the heart of the beautiful medieval city of Strasbourg, surrounded by magnificent timber-framed buildings and the soaring spire of the cathedral, a stage has been erected. On that stage, and in the squares and halls around it, hundreds of people are locked in a grotesque, unending dance. Their faces are contorted in anguish and exhaustion. Their clothes are soaked with sweat and stained with dirt and blood from their weeping feet. Their eyes are wild, unseeing, glazed with a terrifying emptiness. Their bodies jerk and twitch to the relentless, pounding rhythm of the hired musicians. They are not dancing with the music. The music is an instrument of their torture, a whip driving them onward past the limits of human endurance. The healthy dancers and the stoic musicians, paid by the city for their day's work, only add to the surreal horror of the spectacle. It is a state-sponsored death rave, a carnival of madness. The cure was a catastrophic, unmitigated disaster. The number of dancers did not decrease. It exploded. The public, state-sanctioned nature of the event seemed to act as a powerful, irresistible suggestion. More and more people, seeing the dancers, hearing the music, were swept up in the mania. By the beginning of August, just a few weeks after Frau Troffea had taken her first, lonely, tortured steps, the number of dancers had swelled to an estimated 400. And people began to die. The human body is not a perpetual motion machine. It is not designed for such relentless, punishing exertion. Day after day of nonstop dancing in the oppressive summer heat led to rampant dehydration, exhaustion, and physical collapse. The historical chronicles of the time, written by sober, educated men like the physician Paracelsus, the humanist Sebastian Brandt, and the architect Daniel Specklin, record with grim certainty that the dancers were dying at a shocking rate. Some sources claim that as many as 15 people per day were dropping dead in the streets. They were dying from heart attacks, from strokes, and from sheer, agonizing exhaustion. Their frantic dance had become a literal dance of death. Faced with the mounting death toll and the undeniable, horrifying failure of their medical approach, the city council panicked. They reversed course completely. They now decided that their initial diagnosis had been wrong. This was not a natural disease. This was a supernatural affliction. This was not hot blood. This was a divine punishment. Specifically, the council and their new clerical advisors concluded this was the wrath of a saint. To understand their next move, we must understand the specific religious and folkloric beliefs of the Rhine Valley region. In the popular piety of the time, there was a particular saint who was strongly associated with dancing and with neurological afflictions like epilepsy. His name was Saint Vitus. According to the hagiography, Saint Vitus was a Christian martyr from Sicily who was executed during the Roman persecutions of the 4th century. It was believed that he had the power to inflict a terrible curse upon sinners, a dancing plague, that would force them to dance uncontrollably until they repented or died. But as the source of the curse, he was also the only source of the cure. The only way to appease his wrath was through prayer, penitence, and pilgrimage to one of his dedicated shrines. The Strasbourg Council, now operating on a purely theological diagnosis, instituted a new set of draconian measures. The pendulum of official policy swung violently to the other extreme. All public dancing and music were now strictly forbidden. The guild halls were shut down. The stage in the market was dismantled. The professional musicians were sent home. The city that had, just days before, been filled with the cacophony of officially sanctioned music fell into an eerie, fearful silence. The afflicted dancers were then rounded up. They were bound, still twitching and writhing, into wagons and carted out of the city like prisoners, on a forced pilgrimage. Their destination was a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, hidden away in a remote cave in the Vosges Mountains, near the town of Saverne. There, they were to be subjected to a powerful religious ritual designed to exorcise the curse. They were made to wear red chasuble detail rich with symbolism, echoing both the blood of martyrs and later fairy tales like that of Hans Christian Andersen. They were led in circles around a wooden effigy of the saint, while priests said mass, sprinkled holy water, and collected offerings from the dancers' terrified relatives. Slowly, over the course of the next few weeks, under this new regime of religious ritual and enforced quiet, the mania began to subside. The last of the dancers ceased their convulsions sometime in early September. The plague was over, but it left behind a city traumatized, a populace deeply shaken, and a historical mystery that endures to this day. What on earth had happened in Strasbourg? For centuries, the dancing plague 1518 was largely treated as a historical curiosity, a bizarre footnote in the annals of the Middle Ages, a piece of strange history with no clear explanation. But modern science and historical analysis, particularly the work of historian John Waller, have provided us with several compelling, if competing, theories that seek to unravel this unexplained phenomena. The first, and for a long time the most popular scientific theory, is poisoning. Specifically, poisoning by a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, more commonly known as ergot. This fungus can grow on damp rye, and rye was the staple grain for the poor of Strasbourg. Ergot contains powerful psychoactive alkaloids, the same chemicals from which LSD was first synthesized in the 20th century. The condition it causes in humans is known as ergotism, or in the Middle Ages, St. Anthony's fire, because of the intense burning sensation it could cause in the limbs. Ergotism has two main forms: gangrenous, which restricts blood flow and leads to the horrific loss of fingers, toes, and even entire limbs, and convulsive, which causes violent muscle spasms, twitching, writhing, and powerful hallucinations. On the surface, this theory seems very plausible. The dancers were certainly experiencing convulsions. The famine could have forced people to eat moldy, contaminated rye bread. It provides a neat, biological explanation for a bizarre event. However, on closer inspection, the ergotism theory begins to fall apart under the weight of the historical evidence. First, the symptoms don't perfectly match. While ergot can cause spasms, it is highly unlikely to produce the coordinated, sustained, day-after-day dancing described in the chronicles. The movements of the afflicted were described as dancing, not just random twitching. Second, ergot is a potent poison that also causes severe gastrointestinal illness, including vomiting and diarrhea. It's highly improbable that hundreds of people would be physically well enough to dance for weeks on end while suffering from acute ergot poisoning. They would be incapacitated. Third, and perhaps most damningly, there is absolutely no mention in any of the numerous contemporary accounts of the other classic symptom of ergotism, gangrene. It seems impossible that an outbreak of ergotism could be so large, yet so specific in its symptoms, affecting only the motor control and not causing the telltale blackening of the extremities. Most historians today have largely dismissed the ergot theory. A second theory suggests the dancers were members of a heretical religious cult, engaging in a planned, ecstatic ritual. History is filled with examples of religious groups practicing trance-like dancing as a form of worship, from the whirling dervishes of Sufism to the ecstatic cults of the Greek god Dionysus. Perhaps this was not an involuntary plague at all, but a deliberate, secret act of worship or protest against the established church. This theory, however, also fails to hold up to scrutiny. The historical accounts from multiple, independent sources are unanimous in their description of the dancers' profound suffering. They were not joyful. They were tormented. They wept. They screamed. They begged for help and for mercy. They collapsed in agony. This was not a willing ritual. This was an affliction. This leaves us with the third, and now most widely accepted, explanation. It is also the most psychologically complex and, in many ways, the most terrifying. The theory is that the Dancing Plague 1518 was an extreme, society-wide case of what is now known as mass psychogenic illness, or, more commonly, mass hysteria. Mass hysteria is not an insult or a dismissive term. It is a clinical term for a real and documented phenomenon in which a group of people, under conditions of extreme and shared stress, begin to exhibit the same physical or neurological symptoms, for which there is no identifiable physical cause. The illness is real, the symptoms are real, the suffering is real, but the origin is psychological, spreading from person to person through social contagion, much like a virus of the mind. Now, let us look at Strasbourg in 1518 through this lens. We have already established the psychological tinderbox, the extreme and prolonged stress from famine, the terror of disease, and the profound spiritual uncertainty of the dawning Reformation. The minds of the populace were stretched to their absolute limit. Crucially, into this tinderbox of general anxiety was thrown a very specific, pre-existing cultural belief, the curse of Saint Vitus. The people of Strasbourg in the 16th century genuinely and fervently believed that a saint could punish them by forcing them to dance. The idea of a dancing plague was not a metaphor to them. It was a real and terrifying possibility, a known category of divine affliction in their worldview. Now, picture Frau Troffea again. We will never know what specific personal trauma or acute psychological distress triggered her initial episode. Perhaps it was the grief of losing a child to hunger, or the terror of seeing a neighbor die of sickness. But once she began her frantic, involuntary dance in public, she became a living, breathing embodiment of a shared cultural fear. For her neighbors, watching her, she was not just a sick woman. She was a woman afflicted by the dreaded dancing curse of Saint Vitus. Her affliction acted as a powerful, terrifying suggestion. In a community already on the edge, teetering on the brink of psychological collapse, the sight of Frau Troffea's suffering could have triggered a cascade. Others, fearing that they too could be cursed, or perhaps seeking a release from their own unbearable and inexpressible anxieties, began to feel the same symptoms. This is a phenomenon known as a dissociative trance state, where the mind, under overwhelming stress, disconnects from conscious control of the body. They believed they were being forced to dance by an external, supernatural power, and so their minds, in a terrifying act of self-fulfillment, made it a reality. And then, the authorities, the well-intentioned leaders of the city, made their fatal error. By validating the dancing, by building stages and hiring musicians, they poured fuel on the psychological fire. Their actions sent a clear and unambiguous message to the entire community. This is real, this is happening, and this is how you should behave if you are afflicted. They accidentally created a socially acceptable, even officially sanctioned, script for expressing extreme psychological distress. The small, localized outbreak of mass hysteria became a full-blown, lethal epidemic. It was only when they reversed course, banning the music and enforcing a new, religious script of penance and healing, that the tide began to turn. The forced pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Vitus provided a powerful psychological endpoint, a ritual that allowed the afflicted to believe they were cured and therefore to break free from the shackles of the trance state. The madness had a beginning, a middle, and now an officially sanctioned end. The dancing plague 1518 was not a poison in the rye bread. The poison was in the mind, a toxic brew of fear, stress, and belief. It was a perfect storm of extreme hardship, profound cultural superstition, and a disastrously wrong-headed official response. It stands as one of history's most stark and terrifying demonstrations of the power of the mind over the body, and of how fragile the barrier between individual sanity and collective madness can truly be. It is a chilling reminder that the most unexplained phenomena often lie not in the supernatural, but in the dark, mysterious, and powerful kingdom of human consciousness itself, a kingdom whose borderlands we still, even today, understand very little. Thank you for listening. The story of the dancing plague 1518 feels like something from a distant, superstitious past, a relic of a world we have long since left behind. But can you think of any modern parallels, large or small, where collective anxiety, a shared belief, or the power of suggestion has led to strange, unexplainable physical or social phenomena? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this journey into one of history's strangest and most unsettling chapters compelling, please consider subscribing and sharing our channel. Your support allows us to continue exploring the fascinating and sometimes frightening borderlands of the human experience. Until next time, sleep well.